Morning or good afternoon, depending where you are, and welcome to this transatlantic policy dialogue, which the EPC is organizing together with the US mission to the EU. It's been nearly 3 months since Moscow's brutal invasion of Ukraine began. Ukraine continues to defiantly defend its territory and push back Russia. The West is supporting this in two crucial ways. First of all, by providing military assistance. Perhaps they were rather slow in the beginning, I might say, but this has changed. But of course, it's not enough, and Ukraine continues to need much more. We need stuff on an everyday basis. And secondly, by placing unprecedented sanctions on Russia. And I have to say this was done in a very short period of time. It was done very speedily. Particularly by the side of the EU, which normally drags out these processes, but that hasn't been the case so much this time. Still, despite the sanctions and the fact that the war is not going particularly well for the Russians on the battlefield, there is really no sign at the moment, I would say, that President Putin is planning to change course. This means that it's really important, I mean, it's crucial that the pressure on the Kremlin needs to be pumped up further. Of course, as I mentioned, Ukraine continues to need heavy weapons, but this also has to do with sanctions and squeezing Russia much more economically. So today we're going to be discussing the effectiveness of the Western sanctions that have been placed so far and looking at what more needs to be done to stop the flows of money into the Kremlin's coffers without, of course, destroying the global economy. This is easier said than done, but it needs to be done. We need to ensure that these sanctions are hurting Russia much more than they are hurting us. And to do that, we have a really excellent panel of speakers who I will briefly introduce. First, Christopher Robinson, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. Edward Fishman, who is a non-resident senior fellow in the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Timothy Ash, Senior Sovereign Strategist at Bluebay Asset Management, an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Tinatin Akhvlediani, who is a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS. And last but not least, Oleksii Makeiev, who is Ambassador and Special Envoy for Ukraine on sanctions. To the audience, a couple of housekeeping rules, which maybe I don't need to tell you, but I will anyway. Please put your questions in the chat box or by clicking on the hand icon. And it would be great if you could start to put these questions, at the beginning of the discussion, so I can put them to the audience as we go through. Now, I'd like to start with you, Chris Robinson. So the first question would be this. The US, together with its partners, have placed pretty significant sanctions on Russia already, including restrictions on the Russian central bank and technology exports to Russia. So how would you assess the impact so far of these sanctions? And I ask this against the news that we had this week about the Russian current account surplus, which apparently more than tripled in the first 4 months of this year to around $95 billion. So I give the floor to you first.
Great, Amanda. Well, thank you very much for bringing this great group together. It's always a pleasure to connect with the sort of leading policy experts, and particularly this panel. You really have some of the foremost thinkers. I don't include myself in that list, but the foremost thinkers on sanctions policy, and especially to Ambassador Makeiev, who has done truly heroic work to help organize a broad coalition around the world, frankly, to respond to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So, Amanda, it's a great question to start with. And I think, let me start with the following thought, is that we have worked in a united way with allies and partners around the world to impose significant costs on the Russian government for its war against Ukraine, for the death and destruction that they're causing, for the fundamental violations of every international agreement that Russia has signed on to, and the norms of the rules-based international order. We're using sanctions to impose costs, to hold Russia accountable for and officials involved accountable, to hold those who are responsible for some of these atrocities accountable, and to constrain Russia's ability both to continue this aggression and engage in future aggression. So this coalition has now brought together more than 40 countries to level what I think are the most impactful, coordinated, and wide-ranging sanctions on a country, particularly a global economic power in history. We are intensifying the effort to crack down on those attempting to evade sanctions. And to answer your question about the impact, let me just highlight a couple of the actions that we have taken. And I think that starts to point to the impact that we're having. We've designated those who are involved in attempts to evade sanctions imposed by the United States and our international partners. Just recently, we sanctioned Capital Bank and a global network of more than 40 individuals working for or by Russian oligarch Konstantin Makeiev. So we're getting at Russia's ability to evade sanctions and get around the costs that have been imposed. We've imposed visa sanctions and other restrictions in response to both their domestic repression, which has certainly contributed to or fueled Russia's aggression abroad, as well as beginning to hold those accountable for the atrocities committed inside Ukraine. And we are committed to continuing to use visa sanctions against other oligarchs who enable Russia's destabilizing activity and facilitate Russia's ability to continue on this. And then we've gone to Congress for additional authorities to that would give us the ability to take the seized property and use that to strengthen our ability to help rebuild Ukraine going forward. And I think these are having an impact. More than 1,000 companies have left Russia in a mass exodus by private sector. And we're only beginning to see the impact of that play out over time. I think by Russia's own account, they're spending $4 billion a week to sustain their currency. We've seen the increase of social expenditures and military expenditures increase rapidly, draining those very reserves, Amanda, that you talked about. And of course, we're seeing an increase in inflation, of unemployment, plants being frozen. So the intended impact of our sanctions are beginning to bite, and they will build over time. 37 countries align their export controls on Russia with the United States so that we can stop Russia from getting military or dual-use technology. And plants have shut down as a result of that. So we are beginning to have that impact. We will continue to build pressure on oligarchs and those who are complicit in the funding. We will continue to go after sanctions evasion. We will continue to look at the energy sector and how we can constrain Russia's ability to continue to build that capital account that you mentioned upon. But we have this broad coalition that is working together in ways we've not seen before to impose and sustain those costs on Russia over time. So let me stop there, and I look forward to engaging in a great discussion this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. And I'd like to now come to you, Edward Fishman. Do you share the views of Chris? Do you see that these sanctions are really biting, or is it time to really step up and push this harder? I mean, are these sanctions really going to change the direction of the war? Are they enough to stop the Russians?
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for having me today. It is really an honor to be among such distinguished colleagues. Look, I do think that Chris is correct and that these sanctions are unprecedented in many ways. But that doesn't negate what Amanda said, which is that Russia's current account surplus has shut up. And it is still running massive current account surpluses. How is this possible? Is this because sanctions are weak? The answer is no. And actually this large current account surplus is a feature. It's not a bug of the current sanctions, because from the sort of beginning of this crisis, the US and Europe designed sanctions to impose maximal pressure on Russia without disrupting energy markets. And this is a critical point that I hope we can discuss more throughout the panel today. That doesn't mean, of course, that Russia's economy is in a good place. As Tim, Ash, and others, who are even more expert than I am on macro will state, Russia's economy is expected to contract by at least 10% this year, maybe even more. And what we're seeing, I think, also is a slow-moving train wreck in Russia's manufacturing sector. We've seen imports of manufactured goods in Russia decline by 50% this March relative to preceding months. And I think what you're going to see eventually is, as Russian factories no longer have components to make things like automobiles, you're going to start seeing waves of layoffs and unemployment and inflation in Russia as the year progresses. All that said, I do believe, unfortunately, we have reached the limit of the pressure that we can impose on Russia without aggressively targeting Russia's oil and gas sales. All of the things that we've done so far, sanctions on Sberbank, on the Central Bank of Russia, we really have maxed out pressure on Russia while sort of leaving aside the elephant in the room, which is oil and gas. And let's talk about energy for a second. Energy represents 50% of Russia's export revenues, nearly 40% of its budget. So Amanda, if we're talking about financing the war, for instance, energy is really the big sort of the big factor right there, right? I mean, if you could significantly reduce Russia's oil and gas revenues, you would make it much, much harder for Putin to finance the war, or at least make it force Putin to make much harder choices about whether to continue financing military adventures or, for instance, paying pensions or government salaries. The United States, to its credit, imposed a domestic embargo on Russian energy back in March. This is pretty early in the war. So the US, even though President Biden started off with attack domestically as well, which was saying we're not going to touch energy, he sort of quickly pivoted, and we did impose a domestic embargo here in the United States several months ago. And this was meaningful. In 2021, for instance, the United States imported some 600,000 barrels of Russian oil and refined petroleum products per day. So it's not nothing to go from a norm from 2021 of really significant Russian oil and petroleum product imports to nothing. But unfortunately for Russia, it was a drop in the bucket, because Russia, as we know, exports 8 million barrels total per day. Russia is one of the world's largest energy sellers, and 2/3 of Russian oil exports are going to Europe. Right. So I think that has put the Biden administration in a difficult position, because, of course, the United States does not want, continue to allow Russia's oil and gas sales to fund Putin's war in Ukraine. But at the same time, it's hard for the Biden administration to really aggressively take action if the European Union isn't willing to constrain its own imports of Russian oil and gas. So what that means, unfortunately, is that throughout the war, Putin has been making more than $1 billion a day selling energy, much of which is coming from Europe. And in the United States, we're talking about the $40 billion in aid, which is pretty incredible that Congress has passed and President Biden is poised to sign for Ukraine. Unfortunately, Europe has paid Russia more than $40 billion since the beginning of the war for oil and gas. So we're in sort of this perverse position of the West funding both sides in the war, although, of course, that's not the intention for the European Union. That is, in practice, what is happening. So what can be done about this? Obviously, there's discussion right now in the EU about a phased oil embargo, and I commend those discussions. These are real sacrifices that European countries will need to make in order to constrain their imports of Russian oil and eventually gas. But I would note that some of the countries that are poised to lose the most, right, the ones who are most sort of exposed and most reliant on Russian energy, are the ones who are most vocally in favor of these measures, like Lithuania and Poland, for instance. I do think that there is a risk-benefit calculus in which I think the risk of continuing to import Russian oil and gas outweighs the costs for Europe. But I think even if the European Union does move forward to the phased embargo, and perhaps Hungary's concerns are assuaged in some way in the coming weeks, that is just a first step, right? Because oil ultimately is a commodity. It's priced on global markets. Russia can sell oil to lots of places that aren't Europe, right? So it has to just be sort of step one in a global campaign to cut Russia's energy revenues. And for those who think that that's not possible, I'll just remind you that we did exactly that against Iran. We cut Iran's oil sales from 2.5 million barrels a day to under 500,000 barrels of oil per day. I'm using a really interesting program where we basically told buyers of Iranian oil that they could continue buying so long as they reduced their purchases every 6 months. And this was sort of enforced by the threat of secondary sanctions, sanctions on banks, for instance, who are processing payments for Iranian oil. And we also required the revenues that Iran was building up for oil to accrue in escrow accounts outside of the country. So for instance, China, when they were buying oil from Iran, were paying into escrow accounts in China. So this critically sort of denied Iran revenues that it was generating from selling oil. A similar program is definitely possible against Russia. Of course, it'll be a little bit harder, but it's possible. Certainly, if the United States and Europe are singing from the same sheet of music, it would be even more effective probably than the regime against Iran, which was largely a unilateral US effort. There's another idea, which is one I've been supportive of, which is to impose a cap on the price of Russian oil. This would basically equate to the G7 and other leading democracies coming out and saying, that you can only buy Russian oil for perhaps the marginal cost of production, whether that's $30 or $40 a barrel, and basically stating that if you violate this, if you buy Russian oil for a larger, for more money than the price cap, then you run the risk of incurring secondary sanctions. And I think that for those who question whether secondary sanctions are a viable threat against Chinese or Indian buyers of Russian oil, it's always tough, right? I mean, sanctions can be a game of chicken to a certain extent. But I think one of the reasons we should feel confident that a mechanism like this could work is that there's actually a positive incentive as well, that if there's a price cap on Russian oil for Chinese or Indian or Turkish buyers to abide by the price cap, they're actually benefiting economically. They're buying Russian oil for less money than they would otherwise. So it's good for them. So I think it's important when thinking about these complex secondary sanctions regimes, not just to use the stick, but also the carrot in terms of incentivizing countries who are outside of the sanctions coalition, not by necessarily, the types of things that incentivize us, which are, concern for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like China and India, have been moved by that so far, but really by economic calculations, by, this actually would benefit you economically to comply with the sanctions regime. So I think my short take, just to sum up, is that the sanctions are having a very significant impact on Russia. I would endorse everything Chris said. These are, without question, the most impressive and meaningful sanctions we've seen in modern history, certainly against a large economic actor like Russia. But we shouldn't get complacent. We have not maximized the pressure on Russia. There's still a lot more that can be done. And if we just think a little creatively and build up a little courage to go after Russia's oil and gas, which is the lifeblood of its economy, I think we can make these sanctions even more impactful in the weeks to come.
Okay, thank you very much, Eddie, for this very comprehensive assessment. And I think some of these issues, the cap on oil prices and the secondary sanctions, we can definitely come back to shortly. But I now want to give the floor to Tina to discuss a bit about the EU's approach, particularly on this whole oil and gas situation. I mean, the EU is generally a very slow actor, but in terms of this war in Ukraine, it's acted much quicker than before. But of course, the fact is that the EU should have started to diversify itself away from Russian energy at least 15 years ago when it first promised. They didn't bother to do it, so now they've been put themselves in this awkward situation. So it'd be good to hear from you an assessment of where you think we are at. I mean, I understand now we've been waiting for some 2 weeks for the sanctions or the embargo on oil. It still seems to be stuck because of Hungary. Where do you think this is going to go now? But also issues, particularly, for example, vis-a-vis EU vessels that are shipping Russian oil, Greece, but not only Greece. Don't want to blame the Greeks for everything. So looking forward to your insights.
Many thanks, Amanda. So let's again start the issues you referred to. And if we have time, I will also go to the other categories of the sanctions, because EU has been, as you said, slower maybe than the US in many dimensions. However, the EU was very incremental, and the six-pack package is yet to be concluded, but I think there was a lot of interesting things going on at this dimension. So far what we had, and again, just resonating what Amanda has just said, the EU has not even decreased its dependence on Russia, but it's actually even increased. Now, after the fifth package of the sanctions, we saw the embargo on the coal, but if we take actually the numbers and go back a little bit, what actually was happening to the coal imports from Russia in 2010, it was only 22% that EU's coal was coming from Russia, but to 2020, it was nearly half of its coal that was imported in the EU. So EU was indeed very not strategic on here, how it reached this, how it increased the dependence on Russian coal. However, the good sign is that now this is banned after the fifth package of the sanction. The other thing is like whether there are the loopholes, whether there's enforcement issues there. That is another discussion that we can also refer to. Now, gas, the imports of the gas remains right now untouched because the EU really depends on the Russian gas. However, there is a strategy, and we saw more papers coming out from the Commission over the past weeks on Repower EU, meaning basically decreasing the dependence on the Russian gas to, around 2030, which is still a medium to long run, but we will see what's going on in here. But the gas is something that we should not forget. 60% of the gas revenues of Russia actually come from the EU. Here, I think it's very much known for the public. I'll just very briefly say that the Russian dependence is extremely difficult because of the infrastructure, right? We cannot build the new infrastructure to just bring in new pipelines and to then substitute the gas. This is why the substitution of the Russian gas is more to the medium to the long-term strategy from the EU's perspective. Now, what about the oil? So the oil, 60% of Russia's revenues by selling its oil actually comes from the EU. However, when we look at it from the EU's perspective, it's 26%, basically 1/4 of its oil that EU imports from Russia, right? So the cutting oil was relatively easier here, especially because you can then, as other speakers already mentioned, you can then buy oil from some other countries. However, the difficulty here and why we are still looking forward to have this sixth package adopted by the Council is that there are several countries in the EU which are actually dependent on the oil imports, and not only Hungary, but also Slovakia. There's a pipeline there that depend on it. And then, as Amanda already said, the shipments, so the ships from Greece, from Cyprus that were shipping all this energy from Russia, and they're unhappy. These are just private business interests that we would expect to be present at the table. So these things make decision making a little bit more complicated. However, here a bit of flexibility was also offered from the EU side, because as we saw during the introduction of the sixth package, so Ursula von der Leyen said that the contracts that are currently in place, they would have some, the period to basically phase out, and then the things could still go on until the end of August. So this is still a flexibility, but we will see whether, whether EU will, whether the Union will prevail and whether the agreement will be reached on that. Just to resonate with Ed on the oil imports, obviously we saw far earlier the oil embargo by the US, but compared to the EU, US only imports 8% of its oil from Russia. So for the European Union, it's 26%. So that's just, to put the numbers into perspective for the audience. Now, let me very briefly, Amanda, because I think I still have 1 to 2 minutes to just cover the other sanction categories that was not covered by the other speakers, and I'm doing that just because they're actually significant from this EU standpoint. And let me go to the financial sanctions. So this was something that EU, along with the US and other Western allies, has been threatening, to come with the swifting, with the asset freeze, even before the war started. So it's interesting to see where we stand right now. So right now, after the 5 packages, we have 7 banks of Russia, including VTB, de-swifted, basically decoupled from SWIFT. However, let me flag here, this is only 1/3 of the market share of Russia's banking sector. So here you can definitely go farther and should go farther. And I have in mind the Sberbank, which was mentioned by the Commission to be included in the sixth package, but we will see about it. But there are still other banks, hundreds of other banks that could be decoupled from SWIFT. As for the asset freeze, so asset freeze, we don't even have 7 banks. Here we have 4 Russian banks. And here again, VTB is present, and EU followed only after US has imposed sanctions on it. And what we have here, just to again explain for the audience, it's basically assets are frozen, okay? So these assets are not confiscated. These are just frozen. And again, we are speaking here about only 1/4, 23% of the market share of Russian banking sector. So there is definitely a window of opportunity to go farther. And the largest banks that are out of the SWIFT and that are out of the asset freeze are still, well, Sberbank and also Gazprom Bank. So Gazprom Bank, again, from the EU standpoint, because energy is still on the table and ongoing energy trading, this is why Gazprom Bank is not excluding. But what we will see what happens to the energy sanctions, probably this bank should also follow afterwards. And very briefly about the sanctioning individuals. Now, as of the April, by the end of the April, according to the statistics of the Commission, we have so far frozen around 30 billion of assets, and around the transactions of worth of 200 billion are basically blocked. But again, the difficult part here is seizing. It's confiscation, right? Another part is freezing the 300 billion of the reserves of Central Bank of Russia, which is again frozen, but confiscation here remains to be discussed. These are just frozen, so this is not a seizure yet. And maybe I can say a few words about trade. Is just to very briefly sum it up. There is not much going on here from the EU standpoint, just some critical raw materials that Russia is big exporter worldwide, so that also refers to the EU. Mostly what EU has done well is just really limiting the high-tech technologies and dual-use goods that really restricts Russia's ability to produce anything from consumer electronics to military weapons. But this again could have been done earlier so that Russia would not have built its military equipment, or would, EU could curtail its abilities to do so. And I will stop here. Amanda, I hope I was not too long, but then we can discuss the other things later on.
Thank you, and not too long at all. So I'll come back to you again in the second round, Tina, but I would like to turn to Tim now, who's very active as well on Twitter on this issue, to hear, of course, your thoughts on the sanctions that have been placed, but I mean specifically on what impact has it really had on the Russian economy per se, and to what extent have the sort of tools that Russia has been putting in place for the past few years to sanction-proof, if I can call it that, its economy about sanctions. I mean, I think after 2014, the Russians started to put in place mechanisms that would make their economy more like resilient to future sanctions. How effective have they been? So I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, you're totally right. I mean, I think we forget that we're in a sanctions war, right? There are two sides to this. There are two players, right? There's the Ukraine and the West. They're trying to impose a cost on Russia, and Russia doesn't stand still, right? It's trying to evade, trying to send a message, info message in the propaganda war that it's fine, its economy is still standing up, and we've seen that with the ruble, right? I mean, ruble is being managed aggressively to send a message to Russians and everywhere else that actually Russia is surviving all this and it's fine, it's got reserves and all that kind of story. So we need to be mindful of that. Just on the point actually of it was raised about the current account surplus, obviously driven by higher energy prices, concerns about global supply with sanctions, etc. But what's interesting in that, in my mind, is so you have a 95 billion current account surplus in the first quarter, and presumably that's sustained beyond the first quarter. But actually, foreign exchange reserves in the Central Bank of Russia are down by 50 billion, right? So you would have thought there would have been, an increase of reserves by 90 billion, 95 billion, but they're down by 50. So basically, there's a net 150 that's disappeared somewhere. And that suggests to me capital flight. So, Russia's earning all this extra cash, but Russians are busily trying to get it out. And if you look at partner data of countries around Russia, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, what is pretty clear is Russians are getting money out, right? Now, okay, sanctions officials possibly, that's possibly a good thing, right? That FX liquidity in Russia one way or another has been pulled out, and the regime doesn't necessarily have access, or is not benefiting from higher oil prices driven by sanctions as reflected in the current account surplus, right? So that's kind of one point. I think, you know, we need to kind of sit back a bit as well. And I guess, you know, expectations on sanctions are always very, very high, you know, that it's going to crash the Russian economy. It's going to stop Russia now. It's going to stop the war now. Sanctions are really complicated, right? I'm sure Christopher and people who've worked on sanctions regimes kind of get that, right? You know, Russia is, markets are very, very complicated, lots of interconnectivity. We saw that with the Russell sanctions in 2018, lots of unintended consequences. In the end, you want to hit the target of sanctions very hard and minimize the impact to yourself. You know, the impact to yourself, we're seeing that obviously with the debate around energy sanctions. You know, the info war on sanctions is also about unity. It's about political unity, right? It's about, and actually, you know, I think it's remarkable, the political unity post February 24th. We've had the EU, we've had NATO allies, all working together and all on the same page that this is a terrible thing. We need to stop it. And I don't think we've seen such unity in NATO and the EU on a single issue ever. You know, Russia will work to use the sanctions process and tensions within, you know, the various NATO and EU allies around different aspects of the sanctions to divide and rule. And we're seeing that, you know, with Hungary, obviously on energy, and probably we're seeing that with Turkey on NATO and Finland and Sweden as well. So we have to be mindful that, you know, we want to maximize the impact on Russia and minimize the impact on ourselves while keeping political unity, because that's important about winning the information war. And actually, for me, you know, one of the really new and different things this time around about what we've seen in terms of sanctions is this idea of self-sanctioning. Christopher, you mentioned, like, I think it was 1,000 companies have pulled out of Russia. You know, that's pretty remarkable. These companies can, you know, most of their entities are not sanctioned, right? Their activities. They have decided for themselves that, you know, it's morally repulsive to do business in Russia, right? And they've done that because of the unity, the political unity we've seen in the West with Ukraine, you know, NATO and the EU saying that, you know, Russia's crossed the red line. This is, you know, war crimes, genocide, all that kind of gig. And I think, you know, the fact that, you know, big international business does not want to do business now with Russia and will be very unlikely to do business with Russia for a very long time to come is going to have a pretty devastating impact long-term on the Russian economy. So again, I would argue that, you know, we could debate the short-term impact of Russia of sanctions, and sure, there are some benefits to Russia in terms of higher oil prices. But actually, what is absolutely crystal clear in my mind is the imposition of this really aggressive sanctions package and the political unity we're seeing will be devastating long-term for the Russian economy. And Russians know that, right? International business withdrawing, unlikely to come back because of ESG concerns, that kind of new gig. And I think some of the really interesting things that are going on at the moment, I mean, just very specifically, you know, because of this moral, the new moral kind of arguments of the info war, you know, what we've seen in terms of sanctions, we've gone far further than I think anyone expected. You know, when Biden talked about devastating sanctions, the mother of all sanctions package, you know, whenever it was late last year when the US was saying Russia was going to invade, no one really believed that. But actually, I don't think that the Russians didn't believe it. Unfortunately, if they'd have believed the info message from the US, maybe they wouldn't have gone in. But, you know, just think about this. CBR, the sanctioning of Russian central bank assets, incredible. I mean, I remember that week, the Tuesday of that week, someone suggested this would be a good idea. You know, people talked about it. No one thought it would happen. I remember getting a call on the Saturday of people actually trying to make it happen. It happened on the Sunday. Utterly remarkable. And the fact that, you know, we managed to get 300 billion, at least, of the 650 at the time is utterly remarkable. And yes, the Russians didn't expect it. They were caught off guard. That was a massive blow. You mentioned SWIFT. Some banks have been sanctioned, others that haven't. May 25th, we have the expiry of the general license on payment of external debts, right? Massive data points. And actually, again, this idea of you know, hitting Russia harder than hitting yourself. In the end, you know, what we know about sanctions is there's always a cost. It hurts us. We have to be prepared to bear the cost. The May 25th, if the general license is not extended, Russia will go into default, right? And that's a big thing. It may, well, markets have already crashed already, but it may not, for many people, it may not change things, change the dial on T+1. But if Russia goes to default, it will be in default for a very long time, right? It will only come out of default when OFAC says you can come out of default, you can start to talk to foreign creditors. There's a process. It will take about a year, possibly maybe 2 years. But it will, when will OFAC say, you can begin to negotiate with creditors to come out of default? We don't know. I mean, in reality, if it goes into default, be default for a very long time, that will have a huge long-term impact on Russia's ability to borrow, cost of capital, its ratings. It will be locked out of international capital markets for a very long time. And even entities like the Chinese will not want to lend to Russia without, when a country's in default, it changes a lot of things, right? So I think the willingness to hurt Western creditors who won't be paid, presumably after May 25th, because the assumption is that the hit to the Russian economy long-term by not extending the general license, I think there's been a correct calculation there, or hopefully there will be by the US Treasury, that this is a really powerful tool for the US to use to hit Russia. And the interesting thing about, again, going back to this idea, the interesting thing about not extending the general license, it's not as though your leverage disappears once you decide not to extend the general license. Again, OFAC will determine when Russia comes out of default. So it continues to extract leverage. So that's kind of really important. Other things that I think are notable, and this, again, going back to this idea of self-sanctioning and winning the moral debate in terms of sanctions, Russia's been kicked out of most of the investment indexes, equity and fixed income. Unimaginable. I mean, no one would ever have imagined that before the war. But long-term, very, very important because of, indexes ensure that asset managers like myself, we're forced to buy Russian assets. In reality, if there is an index, you're forced to track it, you're forced to buy it. They're out of them, they're not going to come back, for a very long time. That means that, again, capital will not flood into Russia. But again, this idea, it was the moral, it was the political victory, the unity of the West, Russia crossing red lines that kind of forced, this action that went beyond where anyone could have expected. So look, I'm sure we can talk about other stuff, and I can come back to things a little bit later. But let's not focus on crashing the Russian economy right now, although there is a huge impact on the Russian economy. The sanctions that have been rolled out, and there's more to come, will have a devastating impact long-term on the Russian economy. And let's not forget, in the field now in Ukraine is winning. Russia's conventional military capability has been eroded every day. It needs to rebuild that military capability. How is it going to rebuild that military capability if it has no access to international markets to finance it? It has no access to international technology transfers to kind of buy the chips that need to be put into tanks and aircraft and things like that. So Putin knows that the sanctions that have been rolled out will inhibit his ability to wage war for a very long time to come. And he will lose the long-term economic battle with the West and the military battle with Ukraine and the West because of sanctions, right? And I think it does impact on his calculus, right? I think, in everything, this is one of the factors, his ability to maintain some kind of defensive parity with the West, and it's possibly his ability to continue to wage conflict in Ukraine and maybe escalate in the future will be driven by his assumptions in terms of his ability to finance. Actually, one final point.
I would ask you, please.
One final point, actually. Energy is a big focus, right? There's a lot of focus on the discussions at the moment about the energy embargo, right? But bottom line, because of this political unity that we're seeing is, it's clear to Europe that Russia is an unreliable energy partner, right? So whatever happens with the energy embargo, we are not going to be buying energy from Russia over the medium to long term, right? And that is cooking Putin's golden goose. And again, it's going to have a devastating impact long term on the Russian economy. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. You made a lot of interesting points there. That was a very wide-ranging intervention, and we can come back on many of those points. But I have to say, on your last one, I mean, the EU has known that that Russia is an unreliable energy partner for decades, actually, but that didn't stop them continuing to buy Russian energy. And in the case of Germany, if it hadn't been for this brutal war, there would soon be gas pumping through Nord Stream 2. So what their logic or intelligence was, is that quite a mystery to me. But now I want to give the floor to Oleksii, because you've been sitting there very patiently, listening to what we've all been saying. So I would like to have your thoughts on this, and how can we make sure that sanctions are really smart, at least from a Ukrainian perspective? I mean, you've been here for 3 months in Brussels, trying to rally the EU to drive home the messages, what Ukraine needs, why it should be done now or whatnot. So I want to give the floor to you, Oleksii.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the colleagues for great insights. When talking to my colleagues in the Western countries and to Western audiences, I suggest that they see sanctions as a last peaceful mean that keep you from going into the battlefield. But for us, for Ukrainians, and for me as Ukrainian diplomat, sanctions are weapon. And we know that in order to win in a war, we need to use that weapon in smart way. So we need really smart weapons. So how to make those sanctions really smart? At least 3 things. First, smart coordination. Second, smart targeting. And third, smart information or smart communication. And let me tell you more about it. First, smart coordination. This is something what Tim just described as a political unity and unity of the West. And years before, sanctions have been a thing that every single jurisdiction and the government does for themselves, and only after that communicating, talking, discussing with other parties. What we see right now is this unity of the West, and I am absolutely happy that Ukraine belongs to the West, because on a regular basis we coordinate what we did and what we do on sanctions. I'm participating on a regular basis in different foreign discussions like G7 plus or Ukraine EU or bilateral talks with the colleagues. And we managed to gather a big team of analysts and specialists back in Ukraine to provide for our partners information about those sanctions. So coordination is key, smart coordination, number 1. Number 2 is smart targeting. There is a well-known phrase of people who've been working with sanctions in the previous year, and Dan Fried said one of the principles of smart sanction is follow the money. And this is exactly what we suggest to our partners to do, and this is what we try to implement in terms of designating people and areas. And best examples are, for example, as we figured out that Russian Federation badly needs catalyst chemicals for production of fuel. We gathered together with EU, NATO, and the UK and made sure that Russia doesn't get those catalysts. So very important in terms of stopping their army from advancing, or just smart targeting of those Russian politically exposed persons who might have assets in different jurisdictions, in the US, in UK, in the European Union. So we've just not introduce a blank sanctions, but target those who have assets and who would suffer most. So number 2 is smart targeting, and then smart information or communication. Once again, Tim said about InfoWar. and now everybody speaks sanctions. But what we've been lacking in previous years, that governments or politicians avoided an honest discussion with their voters. Why we need those sanctions? Why our reaction to those atrocities are sanctions? And I think President Biden, in the very beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, told to the Americans that, of course, we will bear the cost of this sanctions, but they will hurt Russians much more. And my call to all the audience is: we know that it would hurt you, but think about those atrocities. Think about the everyday losses of Ukraine. Don't you think that $100 gas bill for a month isn't worse that support that your governments and your communities give to Ukraine? So smart information, talking to your own audience, and using that huge support and huge solidarity which we Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government enjoys now internationally, is what I suggest to do. Three things: smart coordination, smart targeting, and smart communication.
Thank you very much, Oleksii, for these three smart ideas. I want to go back now to you, Chris, to come back to two of the issues that Eddie mentioned a bit earlier on, to get your thoughts on this cap on oil prices. Is this something that is feasible? And also the secondary sanctions, I mean, as was placed on Iran. Are these things in the pipeline? I mean, how difficult? I mean, I'm guessing particularly the cap on oil prices would be difficult to achieve. I mean, if you have to get some of these larger countries who are not part of this, Western group on board.
Great. So thanks, Amanda. Both very, very good questions. And I think, again, as the other panelists have mentioned, one of the most important, and Alexei's point about having smart coordination is really the fundamental building block of that. That what we do, we need to do together so that it has the most impact. Putin thought he could divide the West. That was one of, in addition to underestimating Ukrainian resolve and capability, which has been nothing less than heroic and impressive, is he thought the West was not united. And I know there's been some criticism today of the EU, but in many ways the EU has been a leader on many areas of these sanctions, and I think that should not go unnoted. And our Asia-Pacific partners have joined on export controls to make sure that these are effective. So let me lay that as the building block to answer the question. I think you saw Treasury Secretary Yellen made some public comments on these two very issues yesterday, that we also are looking at the cap idea. We agree that we need to do more to address the revenues Russia gains from the energy sector. We need to do this smartly so that the costs fall on Moscow, and that we constrain Russia's ability in the short term and over the long term to engage in aggression. So we will look at the cap among many other options, and we will be discussing this with our allies and partners, because it is something that we need to do together. Oleksii has been modest in how much work he has done, particularly with the G7, to help us be united. And so we will continue to emphasize that we work on this together and find a joint common solution to reduce those revenues flowing back to Moscow. That is true also in the secondary. That is a tool that is available, but it is a tool that needs to be used smartly. So we will consider that either in support of ways to address both in the oil and energy sector, but also as well on sanctions evasion and so forth as we go forward. Other countries need to be on notice that we are looking at this, and we are using all the tools and resources available to go after sanctions evasion and to cut down on any way that Russia will seek to escape from this pressure. So I think these are good topics. These are what we are focused on right now, and we will continue to do that work.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I would like to come back to you now, Eddie, and put one of the questions that I have here, and this is related to China and India. And the question is, how can we effectively deal with China and India? Because without them on board vis-a-vis, sanctions, these loopholes are being left, and this is extremely problematic. And is it feasible to actually sanction them? I mean, sanction China and India. What would that mean? And is there really a need to have a dialogue with these countries? I mean, India has been buying cheap oil from Russia. I mean, India is supposed to be our ally. I mean, it's in a different category to the Chinese. So how should we be dealing with this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think the first thing that we have to do is be very data driven about this and really monitor what's going on, because I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh well, China's undercutting the impact of sanctions, or India is undercutting the impact of sanctions because they're not on board with sanctions. I would just say that it's not the norm, frankly, for India and China to be imposing their own domestic sanctions, right? So going back to my example with Iran, both China and India did comply with the global strategy to reduce Iranian oil sales, right? They both did. They reduced their oil purchases from Iran every 6 months. And through it all, they said that they weren't doing it, right? They said that, we're not complying with sanctions. We'll never comply with extraterritorial US sanctions. And honestly, as an official at the time who was working on sanctions, that didn't bother me, right? I mean, who cares what they're saying? What matters is what they're doing, right? And so I think there are some early signs that even countries outside of the sanctions coalition are reducing their exports to Russia. So that's one sort of good sign. There's some data that's come out on that recently. When it comes to secondary sanctions in India and China, I think the biggest area here is going to come down to Russia's oil and gas sales, right? And it's sort of particularly oil. If the European Union does move forward with the phased embargo, which I do expect they will do eventually, right? I mean, it's not every day where the world's attention is on sort of how the sausage is made in the EU amongst the 27 member states, and it is now, and we're seeing maybe a bit of more slow movement than we want to. We're seeing sort of some of that in the public spotlight. I do think the European Union will come around to this, right, before long. The question then becomes, what next, right? I mean, as Tinatin said, this is 60% of Russia's oil sales are going to Europe, right? So this is a big hole. If the European Union really stopped buying Russian oil, it'd be a huge hole in Russia's oil sales, right? And so the question is, where does this oil go, right? I mean, currently, there's a bunch of it that's going to Europe via pipeline that would then be shut off. They'd have to find areas to ship that on, put that on ships and send it to other countries, right? The most viable destinations would be places like China or India. I think we should be open-minded to the fact that maybe China and India won't scoop up that oil. If they do, though, I think we need to be ready with a regime that basically has consequences if they do, but then also benefits that incentivizes them to actually comply with the regime. And I think this is what's really important, right? One thing about secondary sanctions that I think is often sort of confused when I hear discussions of it is that secondary sanctions, once they're imposed, the policy has already failed, right? If say, for instance, if a Chinese company is buying Russian oil and then we sanction that Chinese company, there's no incentive then for the Chinese company to stop buying the Russian oil, right? After that, okay, they've decided they've lost access to the US, and all right, well, might as well keep buying Russian oil. This has happened in the past, by the way, where we've imposed sanctions on banks in Asia for transacting with Iran, and then they increase their transactions with Iran, because ultimately what you're leveraging is the threat of losing access to the US or European market and hoping then that the target of the threat changes their behavior. So I think with respect to Russian oil sales, there are a few ways we could do it. One is you really just ripping and replacing the Iran playbook, which would be to tell all global buyers that they can continue buying Russian oil so long as they reduce their purchases every 6 months and only pay into escrow accounts outside of Russia, right? This is exactly what we did with Iran. This would look like a Chinese bank paying for Russian oil in a Gazprom bank account in China, and that cash only being available for bilateral trade between China and Russia in non-sanctioned trade, right? Really humanitarian trade and food, medicine, medical devices, et cetera. That's option one. It worked against Iran. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work against Russia. The downside potential for that is, it could potentially raise oil prices globally, right? Oil is priced on global markets. There's not as much spare capacity now as there was back when we did the Iran oil sanctions. So that's where this idea of the price cap comes into play. Price cap has not been tried before. So I think we should be humble. We should have humility in terms of whether or not it could work. But if you just think about it on paper, sort of look at it on paper, you run the numbers, there's reason to believe that it could work, if not perfectly, quite well. And that's because, again, what this price cap would do it would say that cargoes of Russian oil can only be purchased for a certain dollar value, right? So say $40 a barrel, right? If a cargo was sold to Russia was sold by Russia for $70 a barrel, that then would be violating the sanctions regime. If there was a ship that was shipping it, that ship would then be participating in sanctionable conduct. The insurance company would be participating in sanctionable conduct. So there's definitely a negative incentive. But then if you look on the flip side, there's a huge positive incentive, right? If you're China, similar to in my day when I was working on Iran sanctions almost a decade ago, China was said, hey, we're not complying with US sanctions, but we are reducing every 6 months, right? Why would China pay Russia more for oil than it has to, right? I mean, why would China, not abide by the price cap? It just doesn't make economic sense. I think if there's anything we know about how China and India and other countries make decisions, they're going to make decisions in their own self-interest, right? Why hasn't India more vociferously criticized Russia? Because they're dependent on Russia for a lot of things, particularly in the military sphere, right? So if China and India can say, look, we're continuing to buy oil from you, Russia. We're just abiding by this price cap. We're not even abiding by the price cap. We're just buying Russian oil for the market prices. And right now, the market price is pretty low. I don't see a reason why they wouldn't comply. So I think actually the carrot in the idea of the price cap, the carrot for compliance would actually potentially even be stronger than the stick, which is the threat of secondary sanctions. So the last thing I'll just say is, again, on secondary sanctions, the objective here isn't to go out and sanction a bunch of Chinese and Indian companies or banks. If we've done that, that means the policy has failed, right? That's not a good outcome, right? The goal is to leverage the threat of sanctions to provide banks, companies around the world with a choice that if you continue to participate in this sanctionable trade with Russia, you risk losing access to the US and Europe. And for most major financial institutions and companies, that's an easy choice. You'd rather have access to the US and Europe than Russia.
Great, thank you very much, Eddie. I want to come back to you now, Tina, and put one of the questions we have in the chat box, which is from Evaldas Labanauskas. I hope I pronounced that right. He's a Lithuanian journalist, and he is asking, what do you think about the tariffs on Russian oil and gas imports and why it's not on the Commission's table? Would you be able to take that one?
Sure, Amanda. The tariffs are actually quite smart way of sanctioning Russian gas, because that way what you could do, you would retain the imports of the Russian gas, but on the other hand, it would also accumulate the income, right? So that it depends how much it could levy the tariffs on the Russian gas, but then this income could be, used, for instance, helping Ukraine to militarily equip Ukraine, or then use this money for the reconstruction, or they use this money to actually reduce the impact on the European countries while decreasing Russian energy sources in general, right? And I already talked about the single dependencies of single European countries. So the tariff here could be quite smart way. Why this is not on the Commission's table? Well, on that, I would probably not be the right person to be asked. This question should rather we go to the Commission, but are we sure actually this is not on the table? Because what we are hearing, what we are following is just a Commission's announcement, and we see this is not in the CEPS package, but it doesn't mean we will not see it afterwards. Just my guess and my reading here would be that the EU was very fast, and it's it's been very hectic times to actually come up with a plan how to decrease Russian dependence on Russian energy in general. So throughout all this strategy, I already mentioned Repower EU and all that. So, you know, there are many alternatives, and I think EU has been very careful and reasonably careful to pick these strategies that could be doable, that, you know, member states could unite around, and that probably could have the least effects on the average citizens, basically in the European Union. On that, actually, in this respect, Amanda, maybe I would add just a few points on what Ed was saying, and I fully subscribe what he was saying regarding China and India. But maybe from the EU's perspective, what I could add to this discussion is about, like, yeah, Russia needs to find a new customers for its oil consumers, right? But then the EU should also find a new sources where it could bring the oil, right? Especially in the short to medium term, before it phases out and goes to cleaner energy. And it was good to see it was published, I think, a couple of days ago by the Commission. It was already mentioned the regions and the countries EU would see alternatives for importing the oil. This was basically Algeria, also Azerbaijan. These two countries are again the EU's partners in the neighborhood policies, and also Gulf, including Australia, Qatar. So the EU is thinking about it. So we will see probably more on that and more on the strategy and how you should replace Russian oil as well in the coming days by the end of the month. And I will stop here.
Okay, thank you, Tina. I would also like to ask you, Tim, how you view China's role in all of this, and if there's more, do we have any leverage on China to change its position? I mean, it obviously has, you know, geopolitical or geostrategic interests in the war in Ukraine, but is there something more that we could be doing as the West to push on China?
Look, I mean, let's not beat around the bush, right? I mean, the Biden administration was wrong in the first instance in focusing on the primary risk was China, right? And kind of putting Russia on a back burner. I think the reality is that we now know that Russia was the most pressing threat to Western liberal market democracy, right? And now I think realization has dawned that only by defeating Putin in this conflict will the US have any hope actually of pushing back on China. So I think, you know, that's, I think, concentrated minds in certainly in the Biden team, and encourage them to be resolute and you know, cross so many red lines in terms of what Putin said, you know, they shouldn't do. So I think that's pretty encouraging. And I think for the Chinese, it's interesting though. I think they've been shocked at how their, you know, strategic partner Russia has you know, done the unthinkable. I don't think the Chinese expected he would do this. He's proven to be rash. You know, China, you know, China's a winner from the status quo. Russia is Putin hates the status quo. He's trying to stake that up. And I think the instability on global markets and commodity markets that has resulted in Putin's actions in Ukraine, I think has disturbed the Chinese. And probably the underperformance of Russian military equipment in Ukraine has probably disturbed the Chinese. And maybe if they had ambitions to Taiwan, maybe they're rethinking it. Could they, you know, and I think actually many countries, India's been mentioned, that have bought military equipment from Russia over the years, will now be reassessing whether that equipment's any good and whether they should be actually buying it from the US. But you know, I think in terms of US-China relations, I think what's clear is the Chinese, you know, don't want this conflict to further deteriorate the relationship. And I think in many respects, probably the Chinese have seen this as an opportunity to kind of somehow, you know, try and improve that relationship by kind of, you know, not responding to Russia's request to provide it with, you know, munitions that are in short supply, or finance, or all that kind of stuff. I think the Chinese have been very careful, and you know, they don't want to piss the Americans off unduly and further complicate the relationship between the US and China anyway. So actually, I'm kind of encouraged, if anything, by what this conflict has meant for US-China relationships, and having some kind of resolution in terms of that kind of potential conflict that we all worry about between in terms of the West and China, US obviously, and China. So So I don't know. I'm somewhat encouraged, if anything.
Okay, thank you for this response. Now I want to come back to you, Oleksii, to ask you, what sort of dialogue is there between Kiev and India in terms of India's position? I mean, you could also ask the same about China, but I'm guessing there's less dialogue with the Chinese. And then I also want to put to you, as well as some of the other panelists, this question from Ilona Komeleva, who's raised the issue now of this of the blockade of the Black Sea by Russia, and how likely is it? I mean, what would you, as Ukraine, like to see the West do about this? Because obviously this is a disaster for Ukraine's economy. You can't get your exports out. That would be the question I would put to you. But then I would like to put to Chris after you, because she's asking, is there any chance that sanctions could be lifted in order to allow Ukraine to shift? Is this something that could happen? I would say no, but she's asking that. This is obviously something that the Russians want, because they're saying sanctions relief for in order for them to unblock the Black Sea and allow Ukraine to export goods. I'll give you the floor first, Oleksii.
Thank you, Amanda. What we managed to achieve in the recent month is that a great coalition of willingness has been formed around support of Ukraine, around sanctions, around delivery of weapons to Ukraine, and around financial support. So actually, according to my president, there are those three most important tasks of Ukrainian diplomacy. Is to get more weapon to toughen sanctions and to get financial support for Ukrainian economy to survive. And we are happy that around 40 countries are in this coalition. While India is not belonging to this coalition, unfortunately. But we see that if this sanctions instrument is applied smartly, as Edward also said, then for those countries who usually do not use this instrument in their foreign policy, this instrument would be very useful and profitable. So we don't expect that India changes overnight. But still, all democratic countries of the world are uniting with Ukraine for a good sake, and we hope that India will join sooner and later. On blockade of the Black Sea, well, actually, yes, not only Ukrainian ships are blocked in Ukrainian ports, but a number of international vessels are blocked in Ukrainian ports, blocked by Russian Navy and blocked by the mines Russians installed all along the coast. So this is a major problem, and we see the concerns of many countries in the world about food supplies and grain supplies. And of course, Ukraine is having this grain, but there are limited opportunities to transport it out of the country. We have now suggestions and proposals from the European Union on that. But definitely we need to deblock our coast on Azov Sea and the Black Sea from the Russian Navy. Moreover, as you might know, Russians practically looted a great amount of Ukrainian goods from the territory now under their occupation and trying to sell grain all over the world. So we're hunting every single ship which is transiting looted Ukrainian grain to Africa or Middle East, and talking to ministers and prime ministers and presidents of those countries to stop buying looted goods by Russia. So not only Russian soldiers are looting in the occupied territories, but Russian state is looting on industrial scale, and we must stop it with international efforts. And maybe this question has not been put to me, but no relief of sanctions is possible before Russia frees Ukrainian occupied territories.
Thank you very much, Oleksii. So I put the last question to you, Chris, again on this topic. I mean, what can be done about this situation in the Black Sea, about the blockade, about the looting of Ukraine's grains and whatever, the stealing? Are there any ideas over how to deal with this? Is this something that Turkey perhaps could be involved in, being, you know, a Black Sea littoral state? Because something obviously needs to be done, and done extremely quickly.
Absolutely, this is a critical issue here, and in fact, the Secretary Blinken chaired 2 days of meetings, a summit at New York, and a UN Security Council meeting on global food insecurity issues stemming from Russia's war against Ukraine. But I want to be clear: this is not a sanctions issue. There are no sanctions on food coming out of Russia. There's no sanctions from the United States on fertilizer coming out of Russia. But as Oleksii already mentioned, Russia has attacked Ukrainian grain silos. Russia has stolen tractors from Ukraine and shipped them to Chechnya. And as he mentioned, they have stolen untold amounts of grain and taken it back to Russia, depriving that from the global food supply community networks. And Ukraine is a leading producer for grains and cooking oil around the world, especially to food insecure nations. And so this is an issue created by Moscow as a direct and intentional result of their war on Ukraine. So with that said, we are committed to working with Ukraine to find ways to get Ukrainian grain supplies back to market, whatever way that is. We are working with regional partners, including Turkey, other littoral states, to see about ways that we can address this. But again, Russia has attacked ships in the Black Sea, international commercial ships. So this is something that Moscow has brought on the rest of the world, and we need to be clear who's responsible. Now, we've committed additional funds to help address global security. We're going to commit additional resources to helping find ways to get that Ukrainian grain to market and whatever is necessary on that front. But this is something that Russia created, Russia's responsible for. And sort of the meta question behind that about lifting sanctions, and Oleksii said it for us, is sanctions will be lifted when Russia ends its war and leaves Russian territory. When the actions that began this are stopped, then we will take those steps to lift. And we are committed in partnership with Ukraine to defending its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And so, and we have made that very, very clear to Moscow all along the way in the run up to this, that this would be the consequence. But again, the food security is a fundamental core issue, and we are very committed to addressing it.
Great, thank you. I need to draw this event to a close now because we're at the end of our time. So on behalf of the EPC and the US mission to the EU, I would really like to thank all of our speakers for joining us here today. You've all been brilliant. You've shared excellent insights, opinions and advice on a really important issue. I mean, the issue of sanctions is crucial. Pushing more sanctions on Russia is going to be extremely important going forward. Everything needs to be done to rid Ukraine of the Russian aggressor by any means and restore fully Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. We all need to continue to work together. EPC will be continuing to work and follow developments on Ukraine very closely, almost on a daily basis, I might say. I sometimes have that opinion. So thanks again to all of you. I wish you a very nice remainder of the afternoon and a good weekend ahead. And thanks to the audience for joining us and for putting your questions as well. So thank you, good afternoon, and good morning to you, Chris. Have a good remainder of the morning.
Thank you, everybody.